Life here was simple, repetitive, and quiet. People knew each other's names, their routines, even the stories of each family. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed and silence had weight. The family at the center of the tragedy lived in one such stone house at the edge of the village. The house itself was unremarkable, with pale gray walls and a small, iron-gated courtyard. From the outside, it seemed like any other home, but behind its walls, a tension simmered, hidden beneath polite smiles and whispered conversations. Neighbors rarely saw them together, yet when they did, they appeared ordinary, quiet, reserved, almost invisible. Life in St. Laurent was governed by routine. Morning church bells echoed across the fields, signaling the start of work in the vineyards or the local market. Children ran barefoot through narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Yet beneath this idyllic surface, the village had its own shadows. People spoke cautiously, knowing old grievances lingered for generations. There were debts quietly owed, disputes quietly held, and secrets kept behind locked doors. The family, though not wealthy, seemed like part of this rhythm. The father was a laborer, often returning home with hands stained from soil, his face lined with exhaustion. The mother kept the house meticulously clean, moving through each room with quiet precision. Their children were shy, rarely seen playing outside, preferring the quiet corners of their home. Outsiders might have considered them strange, but in a village used to peculiarities, they blended in, just barely. But even in such a peaceful village, there were whispers. Windows left shuttered for days at a time, a faint smell of dampness in the courtyard, a dog that barked in an empty space. People noticed things in small towns. Rumors began slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was nothing, some said, just a family keeping to themselves. Others felt unease, a creeping sense that something was off, but no one dared speak too loudly. Villagers had a way of hiding fear behind politeness. That spring of 1925 was particularly cold. Rain fell almost every other day, drenching the cobblestones and soaking the fields. Mist rolled over the hills each morning, cloaking the village in a gray haze. The quiet seemed heavier than usual, as if the world itself held its breath. Inside the house at the edge of the village, life continued, but something invisible had shifted. Small sounds, the creak of a door, the whisper of a floorboard, felt ominous in the silence. No one could have imagined what lay beneath the house. No one suspected that the walls themselves could hold a secret so horrific. Life carried on in St. Laurent with its gentle rhythms, unaware that within a few days, the ordinary would be shattered. That quiet village, so ordinary and safe, was about to witness a nightmare that would linger in the minds of its people for decades. The shadows of the house hid more than dust and dampness. They hid a horror waiting to be uncovered. And when the first signs of the family's disappearance emerged, the entire village would realize that even the most peaceful places can harbor unimaginable terror. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. One morning, the neighbors noticed the mother had not left the house to fetch bread. By midday, the father's absence from the fields was unusual, though some assumed he was simply tired. The children were nowhere in sight, yet the streets were empty in that corner of the village. At first, people said nothing. It was not uncommon for families to keep to themselves. But days passed. The father did not appear in the marketplace. The mother's window remained shuttered. The faint smoke that had once risen from the chimney had disappeared entirely. Doors remained locked, lights unseen even in the evening. Whispers began to spread, cautious and tentative. "Have you seen Lefebvre's?" someone asked. "No, no one has," came the hushed reply. The villagers started to notice little details that didn't add up. A neighbor glimpsed a light flicker behind drawn curtains late at night, then nothing. Another remembered hearing faint scratching sounds in the early morning hours, almost like a struggle. Or was it a child playing? People began to recall oddities from weeks earlier. The father's hurried trips into town, the mother's tense glances, the children's quiet, distant faces. A pattern of unease began to form, though no one could yet define it. By the end of the first week, panic began to thread its way through St. Laurent. A search of the surrounding fields yielded nothing. The local priest knocked at the door and received no answer. Even the family's dog, usually chained in the courtyard, was gone, leaving behind only a faint odor and the imprint of small paws in the mud. Rumors spiraled. Some whispered about foul play, others about sickness. Fear clung to the village like damp fog. The disappearance of a single person in St. Laurent was unusual, but an entire family vanishing was unthinkable. The villagers could not imagine a reason for such a sudden absence. Were they hiding? Had they left for Paris without telling anyone? Each theory seemed more unlikely than the last. Every passing hour deepened the sense of dread. People began staying inside after sunset, locking doors that had never needed locking before. By the 10th day, the unease became fear. The local authorities were finally alerted. A small group of gendarmes arrived, hesitant, unsure of what they might find. The house, which had seemed ordinary before, now radiated menace. Its gray stone walls seemed taller, darker, as if hiding secrets within. The shutters were still closed, the courtyard empty. The air carried a strange stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Investigators began their search, tapping on doors, peering through cracks. Every effort yielded silence. Every noise, footsteps in the attic, a door creak, a distant sigh, felt amplified in the anxious minds of the gendarmes. The villagers watched from behind fences and windows, a mixture of hope and terror in their eyes. They could not know the horror that awaited them behind that unremarkable stone facade. And yet, the strangest part was that no one had left. The family was still in the house, hidden from view, trapped in a nightmare no one could imagine. The disappearance was complete, absolute, but invisible. Outside, the village remained quiet, unaware that inside those walls, life and death hung in a fragile, terrifying balance. Each passing hour drew the net tighter around the truth, but no one suspected just how dark it would be. In St. Laurent, fear had begun to root itself, ready to bloom into the horror that no one could yet speak aloud. As the days stretched into weeks, the village of St. Laurent buzzed with quiet murmurs. Behind each shuttered window, people whispered in hushed tones, careful not to let their voices carry too far. Every glance at the Lefebvre house sparked speculation. Why hadn't anyone entered? Why had the family vanished without a word? Curiosity mingled with fear, creating an almost unbearable tension that hung in the air like damp smoke. Rumors were the lifeblood of small towns, and St. Laurent thrived on them. Some villagers claimed they had seen shadows moving inside the house at night. Others swore they had heard faint cries, muffled and desperate, as if someone or something was trapped. Mothers pulled children close, fathers muttered warnings to friends. Even a local baker, known for his cheerful disposition, shook his head in worry. The atmosphere was thick with dread, yet no one dared act. The Lefebvre house, once ordinary, became a monument to suspicion. People avoided it on the streets, walking the long way around its corner, as if proximity might draw misfortune. Children were forbidden from playing near the gates. Some even claimed to have smelled decay when passing by, though no evidence existed to confirm it. Each whispered observation grew in intensity, transforming fear into legend almost overnight. Inside the village, a few brave souls attempted to peer through cracks and shutters. They saw only darkness, or perhaps illusions shaped by anxiety. One elderly neighbor swore she had glimpsed the mother's face pressed against the glass late at night. Others argued she had seen nothing, just the moonlight reflecting off the curtain. In St. Laurent, even doubt became a weapon of terror. Letters and notes began circulating among villagers, recounting minor details, exaggerated with each retelling. The family's peculiar routines were dissected. How the father always left at dawn, how the children never played outside, how the mother's sewing patterns had suddenly stopped. Each revelation, small or imagined, added weight to the growing sense of doom. People began to sleep with windows locked, hearts racing at the slightest noise. The gendarmes who had arrived to investigate were met with a wall of superstition and half-truths. Some villagers refused to speak, fearing the wrath of unseen forces. Others offered information tinged with hysteria. One man claimed he had seen footprints leading to the basement door, though it had no external entrance. Another suggested that the house itself was alive, whispering warnings to anyone who approached. Rationality collided with fear, and the line between fact and fiction blurred. By now, the story had taken on a life of its own. Every whispered word amplified the unknown, turning absence into something monstrous. The house was no longer just a building. It was a presence, a dark heartbeat at the edge of St. Laurent. Fear had woven itself into the daily lives of the villagers. Even mundane tasks carried an undertone of dread. A creaking floorboard, a shutter rattling in the wind, a sudden gust through the courtyard. It all seemed like a sign, a warning of what lay behind closed doors. And yet, no one dared open them. The family was trapped, their voices unheard, the truth waiting to shatter every rumor. The villagers could feel it, an invisible weight pressing on their chests, as if the house itself demanded silence. The whispers continued, soft but relentless, until they became part of the town's fabric, a constant, unnerving reminder that something was terribly, horrifyingly wrong behind the Lefebvre shutters. The stage was set. Fear, speculation, and dread had entwined with reality. And soon, the silent house would reveal its secret, a secret so shocking it would haunt the village for generations. It was a gray morning when the gendarmes finally decided to force their way into the Lefebvre house. The rain had fallen steadily through the night, soaking the cobblestones and turning the village paths into rivers of mud. Each step toward the front door felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself resisted their approach. The villagers followed from a distance, hearts hammering, breath caught in their throats. The door, thick and unyielding, groaned under the push of the gendarmes. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Dust covered the floors, and the faint scent of damp wood mingled with something darker, something sharp that made stomachs churn. It was as if the house had held its breath for days, waiting. Every corner seemed to hide a shadow. Every beam of light revealed more questions than answers. The search began methodically. The gendarmes checked rooms, closets, even the attic, finding nothing but an unsettling stillness. The furniture remained in place, as if untouched, and personal belongings were scattered with a strange precision, too neat to be hurried. It was the basement door that drew the first collective shiver. Hidden behind an old cabinet, partially obscured by darkness, it was reinforced with heavy planks and a lock that looked recently forced. Prying it open revealed a staircase descending into blackness. The air that rose was heavy, damp, and cold, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. One officer lit a lantern and descended slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the cavernous silence. Villagers craned their necks from above, their eyes wide, fearing what they might see but unable to look away. The basement itself was small, almost claustrophobic. The walls were thick stone, the floor uneven and slick with moisture. And then the first horrifying sight, signs that someone had struggled here. Furniture was overturned, scratches marred the wooden walls, and in the flickering lantern light, the remnants of a candle lay broken on the floor. But the most shocking discovery came moments later. There in the far corner, the family was found. Trapped in the sealed basement, their faces pale, eyes wide in disbelief and terror. It was impossible to reconcile the normalcy of their home above with the nightmare below. How long had they been here? Hours? Days? The air in the basement was thick with desperation, and the lingering fear was almost palpable, seeping into the bones of everyone present. The gendarmes worked quickly to free them, but the horror did not end with their release. The basement had become a tomb, a place where life and death had hovered together in a cruel balance. Neighbors recoiled, some fainted, others could not tear their eyes away. The quiet village had been hiding a nightmare in plain sight, and now the walls themselves seemed to close in on those who witnessed it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, mingling with the villagers' tears and disbelief. News spread quickly, carried in whispers that could not contain the horror. St. Laurent, once ordinary and peaceful, was forever marked by the discovery. The quiet of the streets, the smell of wet stone, even the soft murmur of the wind through the trees, all seemed different now. It was clear that this was no accident. Something had trapped the family, something that required explanation, something that would haunt every investigation to come. The basement had revealed the unimaginable, but also raised questions that would linger far longer than the storm clouds over St. Laurent. The terror of the sealed basement was only the beginning. What had led to this? And could anyone truly understand the darkness that had hidden beneath the calm, orderly home? When the gendarmes finally pulled the family from the basement, it was a scene that would haunt St. Laurent forever. The Lefebvres were pale, trembling, and coated in a layer of dust and grime. Their eyes, wide and haunted, told stories that words could not. But even in their terror, there were signs. They had clung to life. Some small spark of human resilience had kept them alive against impossible odds. The first sign was the faint warmth of their bodies. Despite days trapped in the cold, damp basement, their hearts still beat. Their breathing was shallow but steady, each gasp of victory over the darkness they had endured. Their hands bore the marks of struggle, fingers scraped against stone, nails broken as they tried to claw at the walls. Every tiny wound was proof of their desperate will to survive. Investigators found scraps of food hidden in corners, crumbs of bread, a piece of cheese, remnants of a life above ground. Water had pooled in the floor, collected in shallow cracks, and the family had used it sparingly, rationing each drop. It was not much, but it had been enough. The faint traces of candle soot on the walls suggested they had tried to light a flame, perhaps hoping to signal for help, perhaps to fight the overwhelming darkness. There were other signs, too. Marks on the wooden door indicated repeated attempts to open it from inside. The family had fought against the lock, against the sealed planks, against the very walls that trapped them. Each scrape, each dent, was a silent testament to their refusal to surrender. Even in the silence, their determination spoke loudly. They had not given up, not fully. Neighbors who had dared to watch the rescue reported a strange, almost supernatural clarity in the Lefebvre's eyes. It was as if the terror they had endured had sharpened their perception, made them hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. They flinched at sudden gestures, clutched each other tightly, and whispered words that barely reached the ears of rescuers. It was a language of fear, but also of survival. The doctors who examined them noted the body's strange resilience. Hunger, cold, and confinement should have claimed them. Yet their organs were functioning, their hearts steady, their minds intact, shaken, yes, but alive. Each small sign, the warmth of skin, the flutter of a pulse, the faint murmur of a child's voice, was proof that human endurance could sometimes defy logic. And yet, even as they were freed, there was no relief. The signs of life were intertwined with profound suffering. The basement had left its mark, not just on their bodies, but on their minds. Eyes haunted by darkness, hands trembling from shock, voices weak from fear. Survival had been cruelly intertwined with torment. Outside, the village looked on in awe and horror. They saw life clinging stubbornly in the most unimaginable circumstances. And as the Lefebvres were carried from the basement, the town realized the full weight of what had almost been lost. Survival had been a miracle, but had come at a cost, one that would echo through the family and the village for years to come. The basement had been a tomb and a crucible, stripping away normalcy, leaving only the raw, desperate will to live. Every sign of life was a silent scream against the darkness that had tried to claim them. And even as they emerged, people wondered, how much longer could such resilience endure against the cruel twists of fate? Word spread like wildfire through St. Laurent. By midday, nearly the entire village had gathered at a safe distance from the Lefebvre house. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, thick with tension and disbelief. People whispered in clusters, their faces pale, voices trembling. Mothers clutched children close, men stared at the ground, and even the village priest could barely hide the shock in his eyes. The story had crossed the line from rumor to undeniable horror. No one could reconcile the image of the quiet, ordinary Lefebvres with the nightmare they had just survived. The house, once just another gray building at the edge of town, had become a symbol of fear. Villagers murmured about what could have driven a family to such a fate. Some blamed neglect, others whispered of a cruel accident, and a few, gripped by superstition, feared darker, almost supernatural forces. Emotions ran raw and unpredictable. Some wept openly at the sight of the family, pale and trembling as they were carried out of the basement. Others gawked silently, unable to speak, frozen by the enormity of what had happened. The children, once shy and invisible, clung to their parents' hands, their small bodies trembling. They had witnessed horror beyond their years, and the village realized that innocence, too, had been violated. The Lefebvre's neighbors, who had passed by without noticing the subtle signs of distress, now felt guilt gnawing at them. How had they not seen it? How had they not done more? A quiet anger mingled with sorrow as villagers recounted the small details they had missed. The closed shutters, the faint smells, the occasional cries they had assumed were animals. Every overlooked sign now felt like a personal failing. Local authorities struggled to maintain order. People pushed forward, desperate to see for themselves, while others tried to protect the family from the crowd. The gendarmes were firm, their faces grim. They knew that what had just happened would ripple far beyond this one morning. The story was no longer just about one family. It had become the village's story, a shared trauma that everyone would carry. Even the village priest, a figure usually reserved and calm, walked among the crowd with a heavy heart. He offered prayers, soft words of comfort, but even his faith seemed shaken. In his quiet study, he would later confess to himself that he had never imagined witnessing such terror firsthand. The Lefebvre's ordeal had become a moral and spiritual reckoning for the town. As the day turned to evening, St. Laurent felt different. The cobblestones seemed darker, the shadows longer, the silence heavier. Every corner of the village carried the weight of the family's suffering. People returned home reluctantly, haunted by the knowledge that even the most ordinary places could hide unimaginable horrors. By nightfall, a candlelight vigil was organized near the Lefebvre house. Villagers gathered, holding lanterns and murmuring prayers, trying to make sense of the horror they had witnessed. Some whispered promises to watch over each other, fearing that evil could lurk anywhere. Others simply wept, unable to find word for grief that had no precedent in their lives. The town of St. Laurent had been forever changed. The Lefebvre's rescue was a miracle, but it had come at the cost to the village's innocence. Life would continue, but the shadow of that basement and the horror it contained would linger, an invisible scar etched into the hearts of everyone who had looked too closely and seen the impossible. The day after the rescue, St. Laurent buzzed with an uneasy mix of curiosity and fear. Investigators had arrived in full force. Gendarmes, doctors, and even journalists drawn by whispers of the horrific event. The quiet village, so accustomed to its slow rhythms, now felt exposed, every street and alleyway under scrutiny. The house at the edge of town had become a crime scene, each stone and shutter a piece of the puzzle investigators were desperate to solve. Inside, the basement revealed its grim testimony. Scratches along the walls, remnants of broken furniture, and faint streaks of dirt told the story of desperate struggle. Investigators mapped every mark, trying to reconstruct the family's last hours trapped in darkness. Each detail was meticulously recorded, each observation feeding a growing horror that none could ignore. The very walls seemed to speak of fear, echoing the moments the family had clawed at freedom. Doctors examined the Lefevres carefully. The children's thin bodies bore signs of malnutrition, but not death. The parents were weak, dehydrated, and covered in bruises and scrapes. Every small mark on their bodies was a clue, a trace of their terrifying ordeal. The experts debated whether the family had been trapped intentionally or accidentally, each hypothesis darker than the last. The basement itself, sealed from the outside, became a central question. Who had locked it, and why? Witnesses were interviewed one by one. Neighbors recounted the strange days before the disappearance, the closed shutters, muffled cries, and odd shadows moving behind curtains. Every account painted a chilling picture, a family slowly fading from the village's awareness, trapped in a liminal space between life and death. Some testimonies conflicted, others hinted at secrets long buried, but all added to the sense that this tragedy was both avoidable and unimaginable. The gendarmes followed each lead with grim determination. The father's movements were traced, the mother's errands reconstructed, and every interaction between villagers examined. Yet the evidence remained incomplete, fragmented. Small anomalies, a shifted tile, a misplaced piece of furniture, a faint mark on the door frame, offered tantalizing glimpses into the events leading up to the nightmare, but no definitive answers. Meanwhile, journalists captured the village's collective shock. Articles described the Lefevres ordeal in detail, blending factual reporting with the haunting human story of survival. The outside world began to glimpse Saint Laurent through the lens of horror. Readers shuddered at the descriptions, but also marveled at the resilience of a family who had survived such an unimaginable fate. Psychologists and medical experts later weighed in, trying to understand the impact of the trauma. They described the Lefevres experience as a crucible of fear, a test of human endurance that pushed body and mind to their limits. Every moment in that basement had shaped their survival instincts, their awareness heightened by terror, yet clouded by the darkness that had surrounded them. As the investigation unfolded, the village struggled to process the facts. The truth was stranger and more horrifying than any rumor. Yet even these details were incomplete. Something had trapped the family, something deliberate or accidental, and understanding it became a collective obsession. The shadow of that basement loomed over Saint Laurent, not just as a location, but as a living memory of terror, survival, and human fragility. The story was far from over. Each question answered only led to new ones. How had the family survived so long? Who, or what, had sealed them away? And most haunting of all, could such darkness exist unnoticed anywhere else in the quiet folds of the village? In the days that followed, Saint Laurent became a hotbed of speculation. The village had witnessed something almost beyond comprehension, and people struggled to make sense of it. Every whispered conversation contained a theory. Every glance at the Lefevre house carried suspicion. Who had sealed the family in the basement? And why? Answers were scarce, but imagination thrived in the vacuum left by truth. Some believed it had been an accident, a misplaced lock, a door sealed too tightly, a tragic chain of misjudgments. They pictured the father, perhaps too cautious, accidentally locking the family inside while preparing the house for some chore or repair. Yet even the most rational villagers found it hard to believe that such an ordinary misstep could create such horror. The scratches, the desperate signs of struggle. These could not have been purely accidental. Others whispered of darker intentions. A jealous neighbor, a lingering feud, or a twisted vendetta might have led someone to trap the family. Small villages hold grudges like stones held in a fist, sometimes invisible, sometimes deadly. Every unexplained movement, every shadow glimpsed behind curtains, became proof to some that evil had walked among them unnoticed. The idea that one person could inflict such suffering filled Saint Laurent with a simmering fear. Superstition also played its part. The region had old tales of curses, restless spirits, and houses that trapped souls. Some villagers insisted that the Lefebvre house itself had become a malevolent presence, feeding off fear and despair. Candlelight flickered more intensely near its walls. Wind whispered through cracks in unnatural ways, and shadows moved where no one should have been. For the fearful, the boundary between reality and legend blurred. The journalists reporting the story added fuel to the fire. They interviewed villagers, amplified theories, and published accounts that hinted at both horror and mystery. Across France, people debated whether the Lefebvres had been victims of crime, misfortune, or the inexplicable cruelty of fate. The story became a puzzle not just for investigators, but for a public hungry for answers and chills. Even among the authorities, theories diverged. Some believed the father had tried to protect his family, inadvertently locking them in the basement while performing routine tasks. Others suspected negligence, or even intent by someone with a personal vendetta. Each interpretation was unsettling, revealing the fragility of human lives in the face of both chance and malevolence. Yet, the most haunting suspicion lingered quietly. What if no one was truly to blame? What if it was simply the convergence of misfortune, human error, and circumstance? This idea, perhaps more terrifying than any accusation, suggested that terror could emerge from the most ordinary places and actions. In Saint Laurent, people found themselves wondering if evil was always intentional, or if fate itself could become a silent, invisible jailer. Theories multiplied like shadows in the night. Every villager had one. Every story seemed plausible, and none could fully account for the horror in that basement. Suspicion was a living thing, feeding on fear and memory. And as long as questions remained unanswered, the terror would endure, lingering in minds, in streets, and in the quiet rooms of the Lefebvre house itself. The villagers could only watch, wait, and fear what they could not see. And in that waiting, the darkness of human imagination grew heavier, threatening to overshadow even the small miracle of survival that had brought the family back from the brink. To understand the horror that unfolded in Saint Laurent, one had to look beyond the basement, beyond the scratches and dust, and into the Lefebvre's past. Their story was not one of wealth or privilege, but of quiet struggle, mounting tension, and secrets kept behind closed doors. It was a tale that explained nothing, and yet everything. The father, Henri Lefebvre, had been a laborer in the vineyards for decades. Hard-working and quiet, he had a reputation for being dependable, yet he carried the weight of years of unspoken stress. The vineyard work was seasonal, grueling, and poorly paid. Bills piled up, debts mounted, and any small mistake could tip the household into crisis. Henry's quiet demeanor masked a mind constantly calculating, worrying, and struggling to protect his family. Marie Lefebvre, the mother, had once been known for her warmth and laughter, but years of hardship had etched lines of exhaustion and worry into her face. She managed the household meticulously, but the strain of keeping the family fed and clothed in such difficult times weighed heavily. There were whispers that her health had been fragile for years, though she rarely admitted it, even to herself. Her love was unwavering, yet fear shadowed every decision she made. The children, 2 girls and a boy, were shy, withdrawn, and intensely close to one another. Their lives were shaped by their parents' anxieties, the long hours spent in near isolation, and the unspoken tension that clung to the house like a shadow. Friends from school remembered the children as polite but distant, eyes always observing, never fully at ease. The family's world was small, constrained, and fragile, a fragile bubble easily shattered by one wrong event. Neighbors recalled small incidents leading up to the disaster. Arguments that seemed trivial at the time, doors left slightly ajar, sudden movements of furniture, a note scrawled in a hurry, little details that now hinted at desperation. The family had been attempting to manage an invisible pressure, one that only intensified behind the walls of their home. Financial strain played a role, too. Debts to local merchants, overdue taxes, and unpaid vineyard rent had created an invisible tension that gnawed at the household. Some theorized that fear of creditors had driven Henri to extreme precautions, sealing doors and locking the basement to protect valuables or maintain control. If true, this protective instinct had spiraled into catastrophe. Yet even beyond material concerns, there were deeper scars, losses, disappointments, and grief hidden from outsiders. Family members who had died in earlier years, illnesses that had swept through quietly, and rumors of past tragedies all contributed to a household where stress simmered beneath the surface. Life in Saint Laurent had been unforgiving, and the Lefebvres bore the invisible weight of every misfortune. It was this fragile, burdened existence that set the stage for the horror in the basement. When misfortune struck, when circumstances converged in a cruel twist, there was nothing to stop the disaster. The Lefebvres' past did not justify what happened, but explained why a family so ordinary, so human, could fall victim to such unimaginable terror. Every detail of their backstory, the struggles, the debts, the silent anxieties, painted a picture of lives stretched thin. And when the basement claimed them, it was not just a house that trapped the family. It was decades of unseen pressures, quiet tragedies, and relentless hardship that had left them vulnerable to the darkness waiting behind the doors. After the Lefebvres were rescued, Saint Laurent was forever changed. The village that had once been quiet, ordinary, and seemingly safe now carried an invisible scar. Families spoke in hushed tones, and neighbors looked at each other with a mixture of suspicion and grief. Even months later, the sight of the Lefebvre house, its gray stones and shuttered windows, could make hearts pound and stomachs tighten. The family, though alive, bore the marks of their ordeal. Henri's hands were scarred and trembling, his eyes haunted by memories of darkness and helplessness. Marie carried herself with a fragile dignity, but every movement hinted at exhaustion, both physical and emotional. The children were thin, pale, and quiet, their laughter rarely returning. Survivors often say that life after such trauma is never the same. The Lefebvres embodied this truth. Authorities continued their investigation, but no clear culprit was ever identified. Was it an accident, negligence, or something more sinister? Theories circulated for years, but the truth remained elusive. Historians would later describe the case as a chilling example of ordinary life colliding with extraordinary horror. Even in death-defying survival, the questions outlasted the answers. For the villagers, the event became a story passed down in whispers. Parents warned children about curiosity and caution, not merely as safety advice, but as a reminder of how quickly life could turn against them. Every creaking floorboard or flickering light became a subtle reminder of the night when normality shattered, when human resilience was tested against unimaginable terror. The Lefebvres themselves became symbols of survival, their ordeals cited in newspapers and journals across France. Scholars examined the psychological and social implications, how isolation, fear, and secrecy could create conditions for disaster, even in the most ordinary settings. Their story became a haunting case study in the fragility of life, the weight of human error, and the persistence of hope against despair. Years later, the house still stood at the edge of Saint Laurent. Travelers passing through the village often heard fragments of the story from locals, told in hushed voices. Some claimed the walls still seemed heavier than usual, the air inside colder. Children dared each other to approach, daring the shadows that lingered like memory. And though the Lefebvres had moved on, the village could never forget the darkness that had been hidden so close to home. In the end, the tragedy left a lasting legacy, a lesson in vigilance, the limits of human endurance, and the unpredictable intersection of ordinary life with extraordinary horror. The family's survival was miraculous, but the shadows they left behind shaped St. Laurent for generations. The memory of the sealed basement, the fear, and the quiet courage of the Lefebvres became a part of the village itself, a cautionary tale that life could change in an instant, and that ordinary places could hide unimaginable secrets. The story of the Lefebvres is a reminder that horror is not always distant or fantastical. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind walls we take for granted, waiting for the chance to surface. And when it does, only human resilience and the fragile strength of family can carry us through the darkness. The story of the Lefebvres is a reminder that horror is not always distant or fantastical. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind walls we take for granted, waiting for the chance to surface. And when it does, only human resilience and the fragile strength of family can carry us through the darkness.